What's up, guys? Levi here, and welcome to the next installment of my Halloween film review series. So, in this video, we're going to be talking about Halloween 2. Now, Halloween 2 was released in 1981 and is a direct sequel to the original Halloween, all taking place on the same night. Now, John Carpenter originally wanted Halloween to be a anthology franchise. So, after the first film, he didn't want to do any more films in relation to Michael Myers. But due to Michael Myers' popularity, there was pressure from the studio to do a second film that involved him. And he agreed to do this film with the promise that after this, he could then attempt to do his anthology series. Now, the film opens up with a recap of the end of Halloween 1978, where we see Laurie instruct Tommy and Lindsay to go down the street and get help. You get Loomis that sees Tommy and Lindsay run out of the house screaming. He goes up the stairs, sees Michael attacking Laurie, and then he proceeds to shoot him. I think it was 7 times this time instead of 6, like in the original. And the filming of it was a little bit different because you saw Michael fall out of the house from the outside, except in the original film, it looked like he fell into the back garden, whereas like in this one, he basically backed up into a balcony, stepped onto the balcony, and then fell back onto the front lawn. Loomis goes down to the front door to see that Michael's gone, and where Michael should have been, there's like a bit of a patch of like a... It's like a human-shaped patch, basically, from where Michael had landed, which I thought was a little bit weird. And after a neighbor telling Loomis that he's been trick-or-treated to death, Loomis then gives the line, "You don't know what death is," and then we get to the opening credits where we have the original Halloween theme song played, just with like a little bit of a difference to it. After the credits, we then start to go through the neighborhood through Michael's POV. As he's walking around through like the back gardens, he looks down and sees Dr. Loomis getting picked up by Sheriff Brackett. Dr. Loomis screaming the iconic line, "I shot him 6 times. I shot him in the heart. He's not human." Michael then sneaks into someone's house where you've got the wife making up a sandwich and the husband sat in the living room watching Night of the Living Dead. Once the wife is distracted, Michael goes in and picks up the knife, leaves some drops of blood on the chopping board. And as the woman turns around to go grab the knife, she instead feels blood, and upon seeing this blood, she then starts screaming. A neighbor who hears this goes to investigate, asks if everything's okay, but she doesn't get a response, so she goes back inside. She's on the phone talking to somebody, basically talking about the night's events. When she sees that her front door's open, she goes to investigate it, and little did she know that that was the complete wrong decision for her to make, because Michael basically jumps up out and stabs her in the chest. And in this kill, we get like our first instance of the use of blood within a kill. Now, I know that in the previous film there wasn't very much blood used at all. I think that there was only blood with the victim at the side of the road, and then the blood from where Laurie was cut on her arm. This was because for this film they wanted to go like a little bit bigger on the kills. We then go to the Doyle house where Laurie is being wheeled out by a couple of paramedics and she's being taken to hospital. We also see a mother taking her kid to the hospital because he's got a razor blade in his mouth. Basically, that's based on the whole old folk tale about taking candy from strangers that could have razor blades in them. But still frightened, Laurie doesn't want to be, drugged or put under, but she is anyway by her doctor. We then go back to Loomis and Brackett, who are still searching the streets for Michael. Loomis thinks that he sees Michael coming down the street towards them. So as Loomis gets out the car and starts waving his gun about, Brackett's trying to stop him. The guy in the Myers mask turns and walks away, basically trying to run from the police, only to get hit by a police car, pinned in between a police car and a van, which explodes on impact. The only difference with this guy's mask was that the hair's blonde. Not the last time we'll see a blonde Myers in this series. But yeah, this was one of the more batshit kills of the series, just because of like how ridiculous it was. We would later find out through an autopsy that this kid wasn't Michael Myers based on dentals. The teeth on this victim looked like they were from like a 17, 18-year-old, whereas Michael was 21. But following the incident with the fake Myers, we get introduced to Deputy Hunt, who arrives and tells Brackett that more victims have been found in the house across the street, and one of them is Annie, Brackett's daughter. And then they go straight there. Then we go to the Wallace house, where the news outlets are covering the story of the night's events. We see one of the victims being wheeled out, and then Sheriff Brackett lifts up the sheet and reveals that it is Annie, and he confirms it to be Annie. And in his grief, he blames Dr. Loomis for letting Myers out, even though Dr. Loomis had been trying to keep Michael incarcerated. After this, Brackett then leaves the film and leaves Deputy Hunt in charge, and basically Loomis still wants to investigate whether Michael is still in Haddonfield or not. We then go back to Michael is still walking the streets of Haddonfield. He ends up bumping into a kid with wearing a cowboy hat, and he's got a boombox on him. And through the boombox, they're playing a news story about what's happened and revealed that Laurie's been taken to hospital. So that's where Michael Myers then heads. At the hospital, we then meet a security guard who's not really keeping an eye out on the security cameras. He's instead reading a newspaper or a comic book or something. And because of this, he misses Michael entering the hospital grounds. We then meet Jimmy, who was one of the paramedics that took Laurie away at the beginning of the film. He goes into Laurie's room to check in on her, and one of the nurses comes in and quickly basically, shoos him away. We then get to the break room, and Bud, the other paramedic, he's singing about some sort of woman called Grace who he wants to sit on his face. Jimmy then tries to sort of play, kind of like the tough guy, in saying, like, how can you act like this with what's happened tonight? And Bud basically tells him about, he shouldn't be getting close with a patient. Jimmy then goes back to see Laurie and reveals to her that it was Michael Myers that attacked her, and Laurie, is acting, kind of like shocked and confused about it. The nurses discover that the phone lines are down, so they go get the security guard, Garrett, to go check it out. Now, Garrett leaves one of the nurses with a walkie-talkie, not really knowing that the nurse doesn't know how to use it, which is a little bit weird because all you got to do is just, press a button, talk, and, wait for a response, but I don't know. After being jump-scared by a cat, Garrett then closes a door and sees Michael stood there and basically gets hit with the hammer claw to the head. We then go to Nurse Karen, who is jump-scared by Bud, who wants to, have some fun times with her, let's say. And they both agree to meet in the hot tub. We then go back to Laurie, who's having flashback dreams. So in one of the dreams, her mother is telling her that she's not her real mother, and then there's another one where she walks into this room and sees this kid staring out the window, and this kid then turns around to look at her, kind of implying that's Michael Myers and kind of giving people a hint for what's to come later on in the film. So Bud and Karen, they're getting a little bit freaky in the hot tub, and unknown to them, Michael's in the room behind them, sort of playing around with the temperature gauge. As it gets a little bit too hot in the hot tub, temperature, Karen gets Bud to go check it out, and they both get out of the hot tub, and Bud goes to check on it. And in the background, whilst you're seeing Karen just kind of sat there, you see Michael Myers come from behind and start choking Bud. Myers then leaves this little room and then stands behind Karen, and Karen, not really realizing that it's Myers, grabs his hand and, starts biting on his fingers, and I just thought with like how dirty Myers' hands would have probably been that she would have noticed, but I don't know. But then when she turns around, she sees Michael stood there and she screams. Michael then grabs her and he then starts dunking her head into the hot tub, basically to try to drown her whilst the temperature of the hot tub's rising as well. As he pulls her head out each time, you can see more and more of her facial injuries because her face is being scalded. Her face is starting to peel, which I think is a very cool visual. I think that was one of the kind of more creative kills of the film. Back at the Myers house, we see a bunch of townspeople rioting and chucking shit at the house, which Loomis was basically explaining to Deputy Hunt that this was to be expected. Once them two get out of the car and they get closer to the house, Loomis gives some more exposition on his experience with Michael back in Smith's Grove, and a couple of kids approach Deputy Hunt and say to them that their friend Ben Tramer's missing, and Loomis asks them how old was he, and they said 17, which kind of confirms that the guy in the blonde Myers mask was Ben Tramer, the guy that Laurie had a crush on. We then go to the local school that's been broken into, and whilst they're checking out one of the classrooms, they find this family picture that's been drawn by a student, and it shows a knife being stuck in what looks like one of the sisters in the drawing, which is again symbolic for what's to come later on. And on the chalkboard, you see the word Samhain. Now, after Loomis pronounces it Samhain a couple of times and explains what it is, we then get greeted by Marion Chambers from the first film, who drove Loomis to Smith's Grove, who needs to talk to Dr. Loomis. Loomis at first doesn't recognize her, which is kind of weird because, like, he saw her literally, like, what, 6 to 12 hours ago? I don't know. She says that Loomis has been ordered back to Smith's Grove because the people there want to ask him some questions. And as they head back to Smith's Grove, Marion starts telling Dr. Loomis about some hidden files, and Dr. Loomis is like, I've read everything. And she says that these were court-ordered to be sealed and hidden away. And upon what's happened, they've opened those documents tonight, and Marion then reveals to Dr. Loomis that Strode girl, that's Michael Myers' sister, to which Loomis says that's why he's back in Haddonfield. He's come back to kill the other one. And he basically gets the marshal to try and turn the car around, but he says, no, I'm under strict orders to take you back to Smith's Grove. So he holds a gun to the marshal and says, you're making a big mistake here. And Loomis says, what is it you guys fire? A warning shot? And then shoots the window. And the car then just does a handbrake turn and then starts driving back to Haddonfield. Now, we go back to the hospital and Jimmy goes to visit Laurie again, but upon trying to talk to her, he realizes that she's kind of gone catatonic. So he gets a couple of nurses to come in to try and help out. One of them's then sent to get the doctor, and as she goes into the doctor's office, she tries to get his attention, but he's not responding. So she turns his chair around, and it turns out that he's been killed. He's got a syringe to the eye. Now, we don't know what exactly killed him. We don't know if there was anything in that syringe. We don't know if it was basically the syringe was put into his eye and just had air pressed into it or anything like that. We just don't know. But as this nurse steps back, in a bit of a callback to the doorway scene in the previous film, we see Michael's mask slowly illuminate. And he grabs this nurse from behind, sticks the syringe into her head about there, and then just starts pressing down on it, basically pushing air into her head, which, you know, getting air pressed into your head like that's not a very good thing. So whilst all this is going on, Michael enters the room that Laurie is in, and he's got a scalpel in hand, and then just starts stabbing away at the bed sheets. He then lifts the sheet up and reveals that it was just a bunch of pillows underneath. We then see Laurie just walking through the hospital on her own, and she sneaks into another room and then ends up falling asleep again. So Jimmy finds Nurse Alves laying, she looks lifeless, and he realizes that there's something stuck into one of her arms, and he notices that the blood is being drained from her body. Upon seeing this, he turns around to go warn the others and ends up slipping on the blood and ends up passing out for a little bit. We then go back to Laurie, who's again wandering through the hospital, and one of the nurses stops her, tries to get her attention, and when Laurie turns around, she sees Michael come behind this nurse, and he ends up sticking a scalpel into this nurse's back, and then basically lifts her up using the scalpel. And as soon as the nurse is dead from it, her feet then drop, and the shoes from her feet just drop onto the floor as well. Pretty cool visual. I would say that's probably like the Bob death scene of this film. Now, following this is the chase scene of the film. Now, I don't think this chase scene is as good as the first film because you see Michael moving at such a slower pace whilst also somehow keeping up with Laurie. Now, after Laurie escapes using an elevator, she gets into the parking lot. She gets into one of the cars to hide. Jimmy then makes his return. He's very dazed and confused, so disoriented. And he's trying to start the car, but then he ends up passing out again. His head lands on the car horn, and all you can hear is just the blaring of the car horn, which basically is the Laurie's right here dinner bell for Michael. So Laurie gets out the car and she's trying to crawl to the entrance, at which point Dr. Loomis, Marion Chambers, and the marshal arrive. Now, Laurie's trying to scream help, but in kind of like a nightmare sort of thing, Laurie can't get the words out. You know, like when you have those nightmares where you're trying to scream, you're trying to shout for help, but you just cannot get those words out. It was kind of like that. It was only after they entered the hospital that then Laurie could start shouting, "Help me." As she continues trying to get to the front entrance, we then see in the background a shape appear under this red light, and we get a close up and it's Michael Myers, which I think is a pretty cool visual. And she goes to the entrance door and starts banging on the door, trying to get someone's attention. And eventually she's let into the building, and you see Michael walking towards the door. Michael don't need no door handle to get in. He just walks right through that thing. Now, after Loomis shoots him again 5 more times, Michael then drops to the ground. Whilst Loomis and Marion are checking on Laurie, and Loomis gets Marion to go call for help, the marshal's checking on Michael, and Loomis is like, "Don't touch him, he's still alive, he's still breathing." And the marshal doesn't listen to him, and he's grabbed by Michael and ends up getting his throat slit. At which point, Loomis and Laurie basically run for it, and they end up in some sort of surgery room with a load of gas canisters. Michael, then showing the aliens from science how to actually use doors, ends up punching his way through the door and getting in, and Loomis tries to fire a shot at him, but his gun jams or is out of ammo, so Michael then stabs him with a syringe, which takes Loomis out for, a minute or two. Michael then turns his attention to Laurie, and Laurie, who's got the marshal's gun, points it at Michael and tells him to stop, but he doesn't, so she ends up firing 2 shots. All you see is that through the eye holes there are blood tears, which I think is such a cool visual. Loomis gets back up, and both of them start turning on the gas canisters one at a time, so they're distracting a Michael that's been blinded by all this blood, basically swinging this syringe around. And after they've done it enough, Loomis tells Laurie to go. And then after Laurie's out the room, Loomis says, "Michael, it's time," and ends up igniting his lighter, then causing an explosion. But it's not over just yet, because Laurie then turns around and sees Michael that's engulfed in flames, then walking towards her before succumbing to the fire and just dropping down. The next morning, we see Sheriff Hunt and all the news outlets that are now at the hospital reporting what's happened there. And Laurie's wheeled out and put into the back of an ambulance to be taken elsewhere. As the film ends, we don't really know what's happened to Jimmy. We don't know if he, died from whatever happened to him, or if, he had some sort of head injury, or if he was just a little bit disoriented from what had happened to him. And the deaths of Loomis and Myers were then retconned 7 years later in Halloween 4. And we wouldn't then see Jamie Lee Curtis for another 17 years when she returned to H2O, although we would hear Jamie Lee Curtis in the next film through using the PA system, and I think she was like the operator on the telephone as well. So, for this film, Rick Rosenthal directed it, and he attempted to keep the same feeling of the first film. The idea being that you could literally watch Halloween 1978 and Halloween 2 back to back and it be like an entire film, which I think was done pretty well. Like, there are slight differences, and you can tell that some things have changed a little bit. Now, this could be because I think this film was picked up by a studio, so they had a bit of a bigger budget. This would be, I believe, his last film that he was involved in the series up until Halloween Resurrection 21 years later. So, The Mask. Whilst the mask is the same one that's used in the original film, the reason it looks different is because in between filming for the original and the second one, the mask was under Deborah Hill's bed, and it was said that Deborah Hill was a heavy smoker, which caused the mask to discolor. And because the actor for Michael Myers in this film was a different one, Michael was played by Dick Warlock in this film instead of Nick Castle. Dick Warlock had a bit of a wider face, so when he put the mask on, it looked like the mask had like stretched out a little bit. That's why the mask in Halloween 2 looks very different to the one in the first one. It's the same mask, it's just been a little bit discolored and is on another actor's head. The other difference, well, the other thing that kind of is a little bit jarring when you watch these films back to back is Jamie Lee Curtis's hair. I know it's a bit of a weird thing to sort of nitpick at, but you can definitely tell that her hair in this film is different to the one in the first film. That's because in between filming for these two, Jamie Lee Curtis actually cut her hair, and I think she was sporting more of the shorter look that she's well known for nowadays. So for this one, she ended up having to wear a wig because this was basically taking place on the same night. By the time she would return for H2O, she was sporting more of a natural look, and then when she returned for 2018, she was back to the longer hair. But because of how, costume design and everything had progressed in all those years between the second one and 2018, it just looked a lot more natural, and it looked more like it was her real hair. Fun fact, so when all the news reporters are outside the Wallace house reporting on what's happened, you get a little bit of a cameo by Dana Carvey. Now, Dana Carvey would end up playing Garth in Wayne's World with Mike Myers, meaning that you could say that Dana Carvey has been in two different films with two different Mike Myers. It's not the last time we will see that within this series. And another fun fact is that the kid that was wearing the cowboy hat and walking around with the boombox, he was Dick Warlock's son. So, Laurie Strode, in this film, for the most part, she's bound to a hospital bed due to her injuries from the attacks that she was victim to. She wasn't the Laurie of Halloween 2018 that was prepared for this. She was a frightened teenager that was literally just trying to survive the night in any way that she could. I would say that her portrayal in the first film was done a lot better. I still think that this is a very serviceable performance from Jamie Lee Curtis. I don't know if I would say this is a best portrayal, but I wouldn't say this is a worst portrayal of Laurie Strode either. Dr. Loomis, to me, is still the main protagonist of this film. I like that after he realized what Michael Myers truly is, he was slowly descending into madness throughout the film, causing the accidental death of Ben Tramer, getting the marshal to turn the car around, and ultimately the marshal ended up dying because of it. Like, he would have been in some pretty big trouble after that if he wasn't killed off. He continued to sell Michael so well, and his portrayal by Donald Pleasance in this film continues to cement Loomis as one of the most prominent protagonists in horror. Now, Michael Myers, for me, this portrayal of Michael Myers just wasn't it. He just seemed too slow and robotic. Almost kind of like zombie-like. His kills were definitely cooler than the ones from the first film, but that's only because the studio kind of wanted to go bigger on them. They had a bit of a bigger budget. They could use fake blood. They could do other things that they weren't able to do in this first film. The only kill I would say from the first film that was cooler than a lot of the kills in the second film is Bob's death scene, because Bob's death scene is one of the most infamous horror deaths. But overall, I would say that in comparison to Nick Castle and then later James Jude Courtney's portrayals of Michael Myers, Warlock is definitely one of the weaker portrayals of Michael Myers. Now, Warlock would go on to play an android in Season of the Witch, and to me, I just think he did that role a lot better. I think that in Season of the Witch, he definitely had one of the coolest kills of the film as well. But yeah, overall, I would say that this portrayal of Michael Myers is definitely one of the weaker ones. So Rick Rosenthal and Dean Cundy, they returned to try to maintain the first film's feeling. It still kept the bluish tint for some of the parts, especially like the nighttime shots, but there were other scenes where it looked a lot warmer. You know, like in the hospital, for example, in the hot tub room, for example, like it didn't look like a bit of a bluish tint. It looked kind of warm, which it's okay. Like I do like that they still kept this blue tint for some of the parts of this film, and I think that some of the scenes where it looked a little bit warmer, it did kind of suit the environment they were in. Now, with this film, they definitely wanted to use more blood. They definitely wanted to go bigger on the kills, rather than the simplistic ones that they used in the previous ones. Like in the previous one, you got a couple of people that were choked out. You got a couple of people that were just stabbed. Whereas with this one, you had the nurse that was lifted up. You had Nurse Alves, who was having her blood drained from her body. You had the doctor that was found with a syringe in his eye. You had one of the nurses that was injected with air into a skull. Like, the kills in this film were definitely a lot more creative than the first film, so I will give this film credit. But when you think of like some of the iconic kills, the Bob one from the first one it's still, I would say, a lot better than some of the kills that were in this film. The only one that I would say is probably better in this one is Nurse Karen, who every time she had her head dunked into scalding hot water and it was pulled back, you could see that her skin was starting to peel more and more. Now, although the soundtrack was pretty much the same as the original one, I do prefer the soundtrack to the first film. I just think with this one, they tried to go a little bit bigger on it. They tried to tinker around with it a little bit. And I think overall, it kind of lost that feeling that the soundtrack for the first film brought to the film. Like, if they would have just used the exact same soundtrack and maybe added like a couple of other bits into it, I think that would have worked really well. So my main criticisms for this film, I think that the recap and the way they shot it is kind of jarring if you're going to watch these films back to back, because of the fact that in the original Michael was shot 6 times, whereas in the recap he was shot 7 times, and also just the way that he went off the balcony as well. It's just it's just very jarring to watch. And I think that the human shaped patch on the lawn, I think that that was a little bit silly when you watch it kind of a few more times. I would say that the main theme is not as good as the one from the original one. Like, you had this almost kind of like electronic feel to it, whereas the original one, it's just a piano, and it's like 3 or 4 keys that are being used of this piano, and it's just so haunting the way that it's done for the original one. The mask, again, I've gone through this. It looks different because it was under Deborah Hill's bed. The actor that was wearing it had a wider face, so it just looked very, very odd. And again, when you're watching these 2 films back to back and you see that the masks look relatively different, even though it was the exact same mask, it's just a little bit jarring when you're watching these films back to back. And the twist. So the twist of this film is very Marmite, and it's very divisive. Some people love the twist, some people hate it, some people thought they never should have been a thing. John Carpenter himself said that he didn't like the idea of this twist. I'm in the camp that I didn't like the twist. I didn't like the fact that Laurie was revealed to be Michael Myers' sister, because I think that that just took away the idea from the first film that Michael Myers is just the shape. He's just an entity. He could be anywhere, anytime. He has no motive for killing. He just, he just goes out, he kills, and then goes home. And I think just bringing this twist and then bringing a familial connection into it, I think kind of took away from what was set up in that first film, but not in such a way that it makes the first film unwatchable now. Like, I can still watch this film and get a lot of enjoyment out of it. I can still watch the second one and get a lot of enjoyment out of it, even if I do have my problems with it. But following this film, Carpenter would get his wish of being able to do an anthology series, as this film was supposed to end Michael's and Loomis's story. But after the unfavorable reactions to the third film, we would then wait another, I think it was like 6 years after that, and then we would get part 4, which brought back Michael and Loomis to the fold. Overall, I would say that this sequel is a very serviceable sequel to the first one. In a franchise where a lot of the sequels, they're hit or miss, I will give this film credit for being at least a serviceable one, even if I do have my problems with it. Continuing the story straight on from where Halloween 1978 ends, I think it was a good choice. It definitely gives that feeling that you could watch these two films back to back and just have it be one whole film if you can ignore some of the differences, such as, the mask and the recap and whatnot. What I will say about this film, though, is that for me, the original Halloween is a classic. It's something that I don't think could ever be replicated. I think that this film, as a follow-up to it, it captures a lot of the same feelings that this first film captures, which when you watch a lot of the sequels following Halloween 3, you'll kind of realize that that was what was missing from these other films. They kind of tried to do it in 4, but I don't think it worked all too well. 5 was a pile of shit, if you ask me. And then 6 again tried to bring back the stalker aspects depending on which version you watch of it. And then, H2O was a bit of a Scream copycat, and then Rob Zombie tried to do his own thing. And then you do get elements of it in Halloween and Halloween Kills from the Blumhouse trilogy. Not so much from Ends, but yeah. For me, this film is a bit, for me, this film is a serviceable sequel. I would probably give this, like a 3.5 to 4 stars, because it is quite enjoyable, but some of the things that you just cannot ignore, like how different Maya's mask look, and how different Laurie Strode looks, and just some of the other bits that you can't really ignore if you watch these films back to back. But yeah, that's my overview of Halloween 2 from 1981. You guys got any thoughts? Let me know. And thanks. And as always, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.